welcome everyone. Thank you, Rachel, for starting the recording. My name is Brian Israel. I'm the chair of Friends of Israel's Environment, which is a U.S. not-for-profit organization that supports Adam Tov V'Din in all of its activities. I think most of you are aware that Adam Tov V'Din is really the preeminent environmental law organization in Israel. It's a national watchdog, keeping an eye on government officials and lawmakers and local authorities, as well as businesses in Israel, to ensure compliance with environmental laws in Israel. Also, Adam Tov V'Din has been a force for environmental justice initiatives, which we'll hear a little bit about today in the context of the climate. Adam Tov V'Din also is a very successful litigation organization that has brought over the years numerous lawsuits to help ensure that the government is complying with environmental laws as well as others, and has been to the Israel Supreme Court many times and has obtained very important rulings. And then finally, and perhaps from a U.S. perspective, one of the most interesting things that an organization like Adam Tov V'Din is able to do, which is different than what NGOs are often able to do in the United States, is Adam Tov V'Din has been very active and very successful in drafting and promoting environmental laws over the last 20 or 30 years, including the Coastline Protection Law and the Clean Air Act in Israel, and has been very active over the last few years on pushing for a climate law, which is one of the topics we're going to talk about today. If you are listening to this webinar in the United States and you're interested in learning more about how you can support Adam Tov V'Din, please do reach out. We'd love to have your involvement and give you more information. So we have an amazing panel today with three experts. I like to say we have 3 experts, 2 countries, and 1 climate. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Our first expert is Yorai Lahav-Hertzanu, who is a major force in as a member of Knesset on environmental issues. Yorai, if I could just ask you, we're going to do introductions here. That if you could maybe say a word about yourself and your activities, as well as share with our audience one fun fact that people might not be aware of.
Yeah. So first of all, Brian, I really thank you for the opportunity to join this important conversation. It's truly an honor. And I see Tammy from Adam Tov V'Din, and I really want to applaud Adam Tov V'Din for your immense, unwavering, and sometimes heroic work on behalf of Israel's environment. Really, I cannot, and I say it with all of my heart, I cannot overstate your impact. For decades, you have been a beacon of professionalism, of courage, fighting alongside us in the Knesset and the many environmental activists defending our land, our air, our water, and our future, basically. As Brian said, I'm Yorai Lahav-Hertzanu. I'm a member of the Knesset on behalf of Yesh Atid. I'm leading the lobby for the protection of the environment and the LGBTQ+ lobby. This is my 5th term in office, and I wasn't elected when I was 14. I was elected when I was 35 years ago. And Adam Tov V'Din is one of my greatest partners in fighting for the environment and protection of and climate and combating climate change. Fun fact about me, my partner Tzafrir and myself are new parents. Our first baby girl, Nomi, was born a year and 2 months ago through surrogacy in Israel. We are one of the first couples to undergo this surrogacy process in Israel, which was enabled by the Supreme Court on November of 2021. And she is incredible. And we don't get enough sleep, but we are the happiest couple alive. She's incredible.
Wow, wonderful, you're right. Is she, will she be an environmental lawyer, or it's too soon to tell?
for now, I think she's going to be an
We'll see.
acrobist. Yeah.
Exactly.
She's
Wonderful.
going to join the circus with
Okay.
her abilities.
Wonderful. Well, we're so happy to have you here. Thank
Thank you
you.
very much for the opportunity.
Great. Okay, Tammy, let's turn to you next. And Tammy is the Deputy Director of Adam Tavadin and really been a leader in advocating for climate law over the last few years. Tammy, could you say a little bit about yourself and also share one fun fact?
Yeah, happily. Well, first of all, thank you for the kind introduction, but I have to say, Yorai, that you left me speechless, and really it is hard to find, I think, public figures that are dedicated to the same values you are and have been working together and actually managing even in tough times to get important things done. And I think we don't always see exactly eye to eye. I mean, but 90% of the time we do, and I'm just giving like a teaser because we're gonna see things from different perspectives here later on. But it's really an honor to be able to work together. So I've been an environmental lawyer, an activist for many years now, for over 20 years. I live in peripheral Israel, near the coastline. I grew up near the coastline of Israel, and it's in my blood. I think the ocean, the love of nature is part of me. But I think maybe a fun fact would be that I wasn't an environmentalist at all. My first sort of brush with environmentalism was when I skipped school to go to a demonstration against a polluting factory, but that was more to skip school rather to demonstrate than to demonstrate. And when I got to Adam Tov, what I said was, I do not want to be a lawyer. I mean, I want to fight for civil rights. I want to fight for the people. I don't want to be a lawyer. So I wasn't really into being a lawyer. I wasn't really an environmentalist. And my years at Adam Tov have made me both and made me proud of being both. So that's my perspective. And I'm really honored to be on this amazing panel tonight. Looking forward for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. And then Ethan Shenkman, who is a preeminent environmental lawyer in Washington, D.C., and who's a partner at Arnold and Porter. And Ethan, maybe you could share a little bit about your background as well as a fun fact.
Thank you, Brian. And it's an honor for me to be on this panel as well with Yorai and Tammy, who are such amazing examples of lawyers who are dedicated to public service and the public interest. My journey in environmental law after law school started in the government, where I dedicated about 16 years to public service in the U.S. government, first at the Department of Justice, practicing environmental law, representing the federal government. And then towards the end of the Obama administration, I became Deputy General Counsel of EPA, overseeing our air and climate issues. Since that time, I've been a partner in the private sector at a wonderful law firm, Arnold and Porter, where we represent a wide variety of clients in every sector of the economy, dealing with environmental and climate change and energy transition issues. One fun fact about myself is that prior to going to law school, where I really started my career as an environmental lawyer and somebody who's dedicated many years to public services, in 1991, I was an intern with Adam Tov, both in Tel Aviv and on a kibbutz Keturah, where I was working with Alon Tal. So I've been following Adam Tov for decades now and supporting it however I can. And I'm very happy to be on the board with Brian, supporting the organization in the United States and looking forward to this important discussion today.
Thank you, Ethan. So, and I guess one other fun fact for Ethan is that, or maybe it wasn't so much fun, but he and I started at the Department of Justice on the same day at the same time, and we were part of a very small cohort in 1996. That was fun for me. I don't know about Ethan. Anyway, let's start with so we're going to talk today about carbon pricing and taxing and a little get into some of the details, but all of this, of course, is within the context of climate policy generally and what we're facing both in our kind of respective legal regimes. Maybe I'll ask the first question to you, Yorai, from your perspective in the Knesset. What do you see as kind of what's the status of climate policy in Israel, and where do you see things going?
Well, I'm usually a very optimistic person, and I hate starting my the first question on a less positive note. But I come from the main opposition party, and I always say that we are an opposition to the government and not to the country. And one of the first meetings that I had during this tenure, during this Knesset, was with the Minister of Environment Protection, Idit Silman, and I told her, "Listen, you'll have the opposition back. We are with you. I'm going to create a network of partners from the opposition to back you on everything that you want, that everything that you need in terms of our support." And I have to tell you that I'm very, very, very worried about this government because it's been the worst for the environment in Israel history. And we are talking about three years since the establishment of the government, and they have a long track of hazards for the environment. If we dive into just to the environmental field, the record is devastating. They weakened the Clean Air Act. They introduced an embarrassingly low and weak climate law. They canceled the tax on single-use utensils, which was very, very useful, and it worked. They slashed the funding for R&D for renewable energy and in general R&D. And they reversed critical policies. They restricted oil tankers from passing through the port of Eilat, endangering the entire city and the entire coastline of Israel. And that's just a partial list. And again, all of this within less than 3 years. But I have to, as I said, Brian, I'm very positive, and I think that we don't have the privilege of despair. We are fighting every day alongside Adam Teva V'Din, other environmental organizations, thousands of tree huggers, of environmental activists against this dangerous trend. And I know that when we return to power, and we will return to power, thanks to the Israeli public, we will not only repair the damage, but also move Israel forwards towards a truly sustainable and resilient future.
Great, thank you. Tammy, from your perspective, in light of what Yorai has described as backwards movement on many environmental initiatives, what are your priorities, and how are you seeking to achieve them?
Well, I think we are in a very challenging time, and I think it's something we can say globally, probably, certainly in Israel and the United States, but globally. But in Israel, it's uniquely challenging time. These have been tough 2 years where the national priorities have pushed climate even further down. It was never high up, but now it's almost not discussed. It's not an issue. Everything else takes precedence, be it financial issues, security issues, and the war going on. Of course, the hostages still missing. It's very hard to talk about climate and the rollback on climate. I mean, a lot of the time we see sort of taking advantage of the situation to roll back on things that have already been done. Some of it has been described by Yorai. So I think, first of all, we are fighting to keep moving forward, to keep going, to not lose what we have managed. But in a more positive perspective, proactive perspective, I think that we are looking at 3 main drivers of climate policy in Israel. And we at Adam Teva V'Din are working on all 3. The first one is having a climate law, a substantial, good framework law in place. And I think it's critical. And I think what we see, Israel has just recently sent a report to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, stating that's the government saying that they're not meeting any of their targets. They're very unambitious targets. So we are not on our way to climate resilience yet. That's saying it mildly. And that's because we don't have a law in place. And when we don't have a law, everything is sort of not actually done. It's not the decisions that are made are not followed through. Budgets are not getting where they need to get. And then that brings me to the other driver that we're working on, which is the financial aspects of things, looking at things, of creating a financial framework that pushes towards better climate policy and better resilience. And some of that we will talk about today when we'll talk about carbon taxing and what needs still to be done. But there are issues regarding insurance. And I mean, in LA, you've recently found that, I think, the hard way. So insurance and investors and bankers, and there are a lot of financial instruments that need to work together in order to push to the right place. And then the third driver is planning, or the planning administration in Israel, which makes decision now that will impact us decades to come. And they're doing so ignoring the climate, both the impact of the climate on the plans and the impact of the plans on the climate. So these are the three sort of big climate policy drivers that we're working on each and every one. And I'd be happy to elaborate, but we don't have the entire night. So I'm going to finish there. I'll just say that all this is being done under also one of our main values, and that is pushing for equity and human rights defense in this fight for climate change, because the idea is building a better society, a better Israel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tammy.
Thanks.
Okay, Ethan, we've heard about some of the challenges in Israel in the moment in the climate space. Fortunately, in the United States, there's no problems. Everything is under control. There's no executive orders. No, right? Is that correct? Or maybe you can give us a snapshot of what's happening in the United States in the climate space.
Sure. So obviously we could spend the whole hour talking about, or all day talking about changes in the United States. So I'm going to give just a high level perspective, and I'm going to answer with on the one hand and on the other hand. So on the one hand, there's no point in sugarcoating it. We have a presidential administration in the second Trump administration that is deprioritizing, let's just put it that way, environmental and climate policy for other priorities, as Tammy said, for among other things, national security, the perception of the need to do things for national security, energy dominance is the theme, to exploit U.S. Energy resources, including fossil fuel resources, for economic, national security, foreign policy reasons, and therefore to deprioritize addressing climate change. So there's no doubt that we have a presidential administration that is going in the opposite direction from, say, the Biden administration and the Obama administration, and in fact is taking things even further than the first Trump administration. For example, it's cutting funding for research and development. It's cutting wholesale government, really slashing government agencies, reducing resources and personnel from environmental agencies. And whereas in the first Trump administration, the government was still putting out environmental policies, they were just less ambitious than previous policies. Here, under the second Trump administration, the government is questioning whether there's the authority to address climate change at all, whether that legal authority even exists. So clearly, we have a presidential administration that is deprioritizing addressing climate change. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a big country with a lot of institutions. We have states, which I'm going to talk about extensively today. We have 50 states, many of which are still pursuing and will pursuing aggressive environmental and climate change policies and will be filling the vacuum to some extent. We have civil society, we have NGOs, we have universities, we have, we have a very strong base in civil society. We have courts. The administration can only go so far in changing policy without, compromising or violating the law, and everything that it's doing will be challenged in court. And we have a very obviously very robust private sector, and I represent a lot of companies in the private sector. And one of the most important values for companies in the private sector is certainty and predictability in the law. And so they are also, to some extent, very concerned about the radical change in direction and the uncertainty and the sort of, the sort of chaos that's brewing at the federal level. And so I do think we're only 100 days into the Trump administration. It's really too early to say how things, will look a year from now, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, and all of those other institutions that I mentioned, including the voters, will have a lot to say about it. So it's early days, but a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unpredictability.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, Ethan. So let's start talking about carbon pricing and what is carbon pricing. Let's start with that, and then what is the role of carbon pricing in responding to the climate crisis. And Yorai, we'll just, if it's okay with you, go in the same order.
Yeah, sure. So basically, carbon pricing is putting the label on polluters, basically creating incentives for them to pollute less and invest energy and resources towards clean energy and clean resources. And it's very easy to speak about economics when you talk about carbon pricing, but I think it's more than just economics. It's actually values. It's about the kind of world we choose to live in, what future we wish to live for our children. And I think basically it's ultimately a test of our integrity, of the vision that we set forth, and our political courage. Because we're talking about very powerful actors in terms of energy. And as a policymaker, I believe that we must meet this challenge heads on with bold and principled action. And I think that's our duty for next generations. Now, in terms of economic policies, it's fundamental, but it's not sufficient in its own. Because it aligns environmental responsibility with economic incentives. And without that, markets will fail to account for the real costs of carbon emissions, costs which are levied on vulnerable populations, on nature itself, on future generations, which have done nothing wrong. And I can elaborate on what needs to be the mechanism and the framework for a good carbon tax or carbon pricing. I don't know if you want me to elaborate at this stage, but I can just lay out the foundation, which it must contain aspects of efficiency and incentivizing innovation. It must reflect the full cost of emissions in our society, not just the direct one, but including public health impacts and environmental degradation. As Ethan said, it must contain predictability for the markets, so that the pricing mechanism should be stable and predictable, that they should provide the businesses with the certainty that they need to innovate and to invest in low carbon solutions. Tammy said it, and it's it's embedded in our values. It must be side by side with, or inherently protecting vulnerable communities, so that the revenues from carbon pricing must be used to shield low-income households from regressive impacts, and to ensure that that the transition to clean economy is not on their shoulders. It must be just and inclusive. That's the basics in my view. If you want me to elaborate afterwards on whatever you want. But my message is that carbon tax or carbon pricing is not just about economics. I think that it's an economy in itself. It's not a target. It's a mean to make sure that we can have a sustainable, healthy, and strong society. And carbon taxing is a fundamental part of it.
Thank you. Tammy, from your perspective, help
Well,
us understand the role of carbon pricing.
I think Yorai laid the most pressing values and issues very well. I'll say this: we view the carbon taxing or carbon pricing as basically correcting a historic market failure. For years and years and years, it's not that carbon didn't have a price. It's, as Yorai said, the price that the public paid, that generations will pay from now on for quite a while. But the businesses did not have to pay anything. It was free. It was free to use our air, our atmosphere as a dumping site. And carbon pricing says, okay, let's take a step back. It's actually at cost, and it needs to reflect those externalities, those costs. And that's also another important issue. And if we'll dive deeper into the Israeli scheme, I think there are some interesting insights there on whether it does actually reflect the externalities caused by the greenhouse gases. I mean, whether the price is high enough. I think it is important to keep in mind that carbon pricing can come, broadly speaking, in either one of two forms, either taxing carbon-rich activity or the carbon trading systems, creating sort of a marketplace for carbon where the market sets the price for carbon. The results a lot of the time is it becomes similar at the end of the day, but the issue is whether it's governmental pushed or a market based. Today, more than 70 jurisdictions around the world have some sort of carbon pricing, impacting, I think, about 23% of the global greenhouse gas. I mean, it's not enough yet. We're not there yet. But of course, this data doesn't include the Israeli tax scheme, so we're probably it's a completely different picture. No, but it really is substantial, but not has not gone far enough yet. So we're getting there, but yes, the idea is putting a price on carbon, and the challenge is doing it in a way that isn't rolled on to the general public, and like Yorai says, creates an excessive burden on low-income families, already overburdened communities, vulnerable communities, but rather does it in a way that actually creates, bridges the gaps rather than widens them. And another challenge is to build a scheme that not only puts a price tag, but also makes sure that this price tag is an incentive to change how you do it. So it has to be closely related to that, because at the end of the day, in our greenest dreams, okay, not one single dollar would come as revenue from carbon taxing, because there would be no use of carbon. Okay, that's sort of the dream. So we don't want it, we want the money to be used, but we don't, but we'd rather, the idea is not the money that we're making, sort of, but rather the impact that it has, whether it actually does create a carbon free economy and yeah, and society.
Terrific. Thank you. Ethan, I know that it's a big question, but what's the status of carbon pricing, carbon tax in the United States, both at the federal and the state level? Help us understand that, what's going on this side.
Sure. So first of all, many or most economists in the United States who work on environmental issues will say that putting a price on carbon is the most efficient way to address greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And again, as somebody who these days is representing private companies, many companies have also expressed support for putting a price on carbon, because the advantage of doing carbon pricing or having a carbon tax, if it's well designed, and Yorai and Tammy were talking about many of the factors that go into designing it, and can be designed well or it can be designed poorly, but that instead of the government regulating and determining exactly where and how emissions should be reduced, carbon pricing gives the market the flexibility to find the cheapest way to lower emissions. So for that, so there's social reasons, political reasons, economic reasons, but I think there's also business reasons why a well-designed carbon pricing scheme is something that in theory could and should receive a lot of support. Notwithstanding that, the United States has not been successful in establishing a national carbon pricing scheme or a national trading scheme. And it's very interesting to think about why that is. But I think one of the most fundamental reasons is it's political, there's a lot of political opposition to the idea of taxing anything or to raising prices for consumers. It's a very controversial topic in the United States. And at the federal level, there are some things I can talk about later that take some steps towards carbon pricing, like the social cost of carbon metric. But for the most part, the United States has not adopted carbon pricing policy or a carbon tax or anything, or cap and trade or anything like that at the national level. However, as I said before, and this is really critical and a theme throughout of what I want to talk about today, is that we have 50 states. And that is an important thing to understand about the United States, is that we have a federal system where a lot of power resides in the 50 states. And in fact, sometimes the states are referred to as the laboratory of democracy. That is where policies can be tried, they can succeed, they can fail, they create lessons, best practices for other states, and provide lessons for the national government as well. There are significant carbon pricing programs right now in 13 states in the United States. I think that's the right figure. It's around 13. And these are some pretty important states, including California and New York, that are home to over 30% of the US population and account for more than 36% of US gross domestic product. And the states are California, Oregon, Washington on the West Coast. These are the coastal states, by the way, and 10 northeastern states that are in a program called RGGI: Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Virginia used to be part of it, but pulled out. Pennsylvania is right now in limbo because its participation in the program has been challenged in the courts. But this is some, I'd like to come back to this topic, Brian, and provide some more detailed examples. But just at a high level, I'll point out that the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, which is the 10 northeastern states, they have a cap and trade system essentially for power plants, just covers the power sector. On the West Coast, in states like California and more recently Washington State, their market-based trading mechanisms, cap and trade systems, are more economy-wide. And so they're taking different approaches, and we're learning a lot. These markets have been in place now for several years, and there are a lot of lessons to draw. And notwithstanding what might happen with federal policy, we're going to continue to see states pursuing these policies and experimenting with them. And I think it's really important to learn from both the successes and failures of these programs at the state level.
Great. And of course, California, as the if it were a country, would be the fourth largest economy in the world. Having a cap and trade or a carbon pricing system regime is somewhat encouraging, even if it's not sufficient. But Tammy, you raised an interesting question in your comments about how the price gets set, and Yorai, you were talking about sort of essentially pricing the externality. There's so many difficult issues there with respect to how you set the price, how you define externalities. It used to be a little bit easier when we were talking about conventional pollutants, and the externality was experienced within a fairly narrow geographic region. Here we're talking about externalities that might not really be impacting, at least not directly. Well, it's just a much broader metric or scope. What are your thoughts, Tammy? You went off mute, so I'll let you go first, and then you can disagree with Tammy.
No, I think actually we'll probably agree on this point. First of all, in Israel, you're right. It's a very complex issue, and setting a price is always sort of science and guesswork. Okay, it's a combination, and some of when you do a carbon taxing scheme, you need to look at it more carefully because you're not trusting the market to set the value. In Israel, I have to say, there is an agreement between ministries, the government, even the anti-climate finance ministry, the Treasury of Israel, and the Ministry of Environmental Protection, about what is the price of externalities of various pollutants, including greenhouse gases. So there's an agreement on the number, but there's not an agreement on what to do with that number. I mean, whether it has any actual impact on anything. And I think the carbon tax scheme in Israel, which, and we've mentioned it before, it's a success in the fact that we have a taxation scheme. Okay, so that's a step forward. But one of the biggest problems, and that relates to your question, Brian, is that, for instance, the natural gas is priced, the price tag on natural gas is very low. It reflects, I think, about a third of its actual external costs. Again, a number that is agreed upon. I mean, it's not in controversy in Israel. They decided knowingly to not put a sufficient price on natural gas because the idea was to move from coal and solar and not solar, sorry, and diesel into to move through natural gas. But the end game, the what we're looking at the end must be renewable energy. I mean, that's a transition we're looking for. We're not looking for a transition to another greenhouse gas fossil fuel based economy. So they create an incentive basically for companies to move towards natural gas. That is anti-climate. That is not where we're looking at, and that was a decision that's basically political. It's not an issue of, oh, I think that we need to estimate this price at another number, or I don't think it will be that dramatic. No, I understand this is the price, and I don't care about it. And just to sort of give us a feeling, this means that by 2030, the damages of natural gas, of the externalities of natural gas, looking at that agreed upon number will be around 10 billion new Israeli shekels, whereas the revenues from tax will only be 3. So it doesn't reflect the externalities, it doesn't make the polluter pay, and it doesn't incentivize, and that's the worst thing, it doesn't really incentivizes going into a green economy, a net zero economy. So I think that's one of our biggest challenges, and that's something that has to be changed.
Yorai, do you have maybe you have a different perspective, or maybe not a different perspective, but if you could elaborate a little bit on what you see that are the real politic challenges to getting the price right.
Yeah, sure. For your first question, I think that we need to find a balance in terms of policy, in that for the one part would enable those industries to keep running, to not collapse them. If it's too heavy, then they'll collapse, and then we missed on the opportunity to shift their policy into and creative incentives on shifting their polluting conduct into green energy and more cleaner ways of functioning. But I think that one other very important element is not only how and how much we price or set the tax on, but what we do with the revenues. And as you said, and as Tammy mentioned, for the very first time, the Israeli government has recently introduced a carbon tax. Now, it's deeply flawed, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the very fact, and I'm starting with the opportunity, that even this anti-environmental government recognized the need for such a mechanism is an accomplishment. And I don't know whether it's the pressure of Europe's external carbon border adjustment mechanism, or just the understanding that Israel must act to protect its economic competitiveness. The message is clear, I think, for this government as well, that carbon pricing is no longer an option; it's a necessity. But I want to elaborate on the challenges that this. I told you on previously that I think it's an Israbluff, and I think that alongside the opportunity, the challenges are huge. This carbon tax, as it was introduced, first of all, is set at a very low rate to drive meaningful emissions reduction. It's phased in so slowly that its real impact will only be felt in years down the line, if at all. But worse, I don't know if you know this, but major polluting, as Tammy said, sectors have been granted broad exemptions. But 98% of the the carbon tax revenues are tunneled back to the polluters themselves. 98% of what they're paying is being returned to them, creating no real incentives to transition to a cleaner system. I mean, they pay tax and they receive almost 100% of it back. So what kind of incentives do they have to transition to cleaner energy or green energy? And I say that without a serious plan to fairly return those revenues to the public and shield vulnerable communities, the tax risks being not seen as a climate tool, but I mean as an economic burden. This is how they see it, and so in order for it to be effective, it needs to be balanced, but it also needs to contain some kind of ambition, a vision, and some kind of fairness. And I think that this carbon tax lacks all of them. And the mechanism is I mean, they say we have a carbon tax, but it lacks all of the ingredients of carbon tax. It will do nothing to change reality. And so what we need is a leadership that understands that we need ambition and that we need to recruit the industries that with environmental responsibility, we need to do it together in order to create a sustainable future. And that's not the case.
So this is eye-opening, I think, for many of us in the United States. Maybe you could just explain the mechanism here. So you're saying in Israel there is a carbon tax, but essentially there is no carbon tax. Is that because it's just a recycling?
They introduced a carbon tax where 90% of the tax is being returned to the polluters, creating no efficient incentive, and the revenues are not tunneled to investment in creating options, cleaner options. So essentially they're levying a tax and then transferring the revenues to the polluters. So there's a nice headline, but there's no substance beneath it. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, are they really fooling the Europeans who are presumably or how is it? How it's just so blatantly not effective. But yeah, Tammy.
Well,
I agree.
I say this. First of all, yes, the CBAM, the European tax correction, border correction scheme is a major incentive for the Israel tax, for this Israeli tax. The idea is, okay, I'm not protecting, I'm not defending the government. That's not my, at all my goal. But I'll say this, the idea was to both not burden and not expose industry to unfair competition with the industries that are competing with them, which are mostly not European industries. Okay, that's the claim. I'm just sort of playing it out so we'll understand the rationale, because it's not done without rationalizing. It's just I agree that it's a very problematic rationalizing, and the scheme is problematic. The idea is to push for yes, the money comes back, but again, if you pay less taxes, you'll get more revenues. So it still does have some sort of impact, but in a way that they really didn't want the industry not to object to the law and to not feel it in their pocket. So it's kind of like, and I'll just be, because we're in a family sort of atmosphere here, I'm gonna go back to my grandmother who's in the kitchen and making a borscht and wants me to borscht is a beetroot soup. Ethan, you're now in an area where you probably can taste some good beetroot soups. And she's making it, and I told her I don't like beetroot, and she says, "No, but I only put a little bit. You won't notice it." So okay, but if I won't notice it, then why do I need to drink it to taste it? So it's sort of we want them to it's we're using it, but we are not using enough for it to be even felt actually, and then but we are doing it. So it's kind of trying to enjoy all worlds. In a very problematic way, which I hope will still push some of the industry forward, but it's not as incentivizing as we would expect a better designed tax scheme to work. I do think that it's a huge step forward that we have a tax scheme. I mean, there is what we have is an understanding, and throughout now all sectors and from the government, and again, like I say, even in a very anti-climate government, we have an understanding, and it's set in a statutory form that carbon needs to be taxed. Okay, and it will be very hard to roll back on it, and it gives us a good platform now to push forward. So we have the framework. Now we need to make the substance work better.
Yeah, I agree.
So Ethan and I in our regime here, we have the Congress will establish the statutory framework, and then the executive branch might issue regulations. Is it that if, as Yorai predicts, there will be a change of government at some point, that would the government itself be able to adjust both the price and the revenue, or would that require additional Knesset action?
Well, it can be done by the government, and in Israel, in general, the government enjoys the support of the Knesset, of the parliament. So it's if the government will want to, it will have also the support of the Knesset. But I'd also say this: Yorai managed, and we're very happy that to make them include a very important paragraph on reporting and mandatory reporting and how many revenues come in. Now, it seems maybe trivial, okay, that reporting is it makes sense, but we see from other schemes like the fund that is supposed to get the revenue from natural gas. Okay, we have a fund, current fund, and a law that's supposed to get revenues from natural gas. And it's very not public, and it's very not transparent, and we need to fight for information, and we need to because tax laws allow people to hide behind sort of financial secrecy laws. So it's everything is very on the on the hush hush, and the fact that they'll have mandatory reporting, and we will see where the revenues come in and from where they come in and where they're used, that's a very powerful tool in order to re-examine and come back to the numbers we've set, and perhaps, hopefully, bring them up to a more to a stronger scheme.
Okay. Let me ask Ethan, I'm going to pivot the conversation. We don't have that much time left. I want to talk a little bit about equity and how a carbon price, carbon tax would be implemented in a way that's fair for vulnerable populations, Yorai, as you were saying, and just the whole concept of climate justice. Ethan,
Yeah.
maybe you can provide your perspective on that, and then
Well,
we'll hear from Yorai and Tammy.
And Brian, if okay with you, I would just like to give the example of what has been happening in Washington State,
Sure.
which addresses your question, but also something that I'd be curious what Tammy and Yorai have to say about this in Israel. These programs cannot succeed without sufficient public support, right? And how to gain public support, how to educate people that this is something that's not just making electricity more expensive or gasoline more expensive, it's something that is, good for them and for their communities. I think is a big challenge. So, quick story about Washington State. They enacted something called the Climate Commitment Act in 2021. It sets up a emissions trading scheme where it sets a cap on total carbon emissions that is ratcheted down over time and allocates allowances to large scale industrial facilities and fuel suppliers. And then the allowances are also sold at auction. So it's an auction-based mechanism that determines the price for the allowances, that sets the carbon price. Interestingly, I think it was maybe 2023 was the first auction, and the allowances were selling for around $50 metric ton carbon. The prices were going up to about $60 a ton. And then in 2024, the prices crashed. And the prices crashed in part because opponents of this program had submitted a proposed ballot measure for all of the citizens to vote on in November of 2024 to repeal this measure. And the main argument for repealing it was that it was creating an increase in prices for gasoline and diesel at the pump. And if you know anything about American politics, right? Big issue, price of eggs, big issue in the last election, but price of gasoline is a very sensitive political issue. And there were arguments that because of these allowances, the prices were being passed on to consumers, and so gas prices were significantly increasing. And there was a big this last election in November of 2024, while we were having this big presidential election, there was a big political fight in Washington State about whether to keep this carbon pricing scheme. And a lot of industry supported keeping it because it put in place a regime that at least was predictable, that gave them some certainty that they could project out 5-10 years what they're going to need to do and sort of, what it was going to cost. And in the same election where President Trump did so well, the ballot measure to repeal this law was defeated overwhelmingly. I think something over 60% of the voters in Washington State voted to keep this law, even though it was, there were a lot of arguments that it was increasing gasoline prices. Now, I don't know. I don't have a recipe for how that would, how they succeeded politically, but it was incredibly important for civil society and for industry and the private sector and the NGOs all to sort of to get together and to come up with the arguments and the narrative that the voters could support for keeping this law. And so, unfortunately, the Trump administration has now said in one of its latest executive orders, has asked the Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice to investigate whether these types of cap and trade laws are illegal. So we'll see what happens there. But from a public support perspective, this was a little bit of a success story, a little bit of a sort of hopeful message that I would leave with. And very curious to see what you guys think about public support for these types of measures in Israel.
Thanks, Ethan. All right, Tammy, why don't you take that question, then we'll let Yorai have the last word.
Absolutely. I think public support is crucial. Again, it's hard to get the public attention, but when we look at all surveys about climate, one held by the Israel National Security Institute, for instance, shows that the majority of the public in Israel do feel that there is a need for more stringent, for stronger climate policy. I think the most of the public understands. However, I'm not sure how it will be if it actually impact them. Or moreover, people do not vote on climate in Israel. They simply do not. Very, very few people will change their vote because of climate issue. Even within, it's not like the United States where you need to choose between the two. It's even within, if you have a few various options that are sort of somehow relevant to your views, and very rarely the issue of climate will be the one that will change the needle and will make the people actually vote, unfortunately, because for me it is an issue I do vote on upon. So I think we still have our work cut out in conveying the message that the climate issue, it's not something that's is alongside the issues like security, like financial resilience, like health. It's actually at the basis of everything. I mean, if we do not take care of the climate, we do not manage to to be as strong, as independent, as resilient as we want to be, a just society as we want to be, to make as much money as we want to. I mean, we need to take care of the climate, and it's crucial. And I think that is one of our biggest challenges. But what I think is the most optimistic thing is that, yes, this government is very anti-climate, but traditionally in Israel, and I think we're very different from the United States in that sense, climate is an issue you can work on with people from all political parties, sectors. They are, you can talk with secular and religious and Jewish and Arab, and it's something that actually can bring together people from very, very different views within the Knesset. And I think Yorai gave a great example for that with his first offer to the minister, because it is a matter where we can come together over and not be separated. And that's very different from most of the issues today. So I'm hopeful.
Amen. Thank you. All right, Yorai, bring us home.
Yeah. Yeah. Israel's population is going to double itself in the next 30 years, and it's going to be one of the densest places around the world. I think the most from the developed world. And I think that any public policy which is not sustainable is flawed. And I think that a paradigm where you want to save now and maybe spend a little more later is flawed. And we talked about carbon tax, and people, including the industry, consider it as a burden. And I think that it's the other way around. I mean, it's an investment, and Israel is now in a very big financial crisis. And I think the way out of the crisis is invest in research and development, in clean energy, in those industries, in the clean industry, which will create multiple jobs and create. I mean, for investment in R&D, you for 1 cent you get 6 cents back. I mean, it's a win-win, and I think that the Treasury Ministry in Israel is wrapped up and believes in a wrong paradigm, and we need the public support. And Tammy is a great force in that. We need to persuade them and the public that we need to shift our policy towards a sustainable one, because this is the only way to move forward. And I know it because I'm living within my public, that we'll get there. And I'm very optimistic about the future. I'm very optimistic about the prospects of the next government and its ability to bring about real change in how we manage the protection of our environment and climate and combating climate change. And I know that with our great partners, among them Adam Teva Vadin, we will manage to complete most of our tasks and meet most of our objectives.
Thank you so much, Yorai. Thank you. And thank you all. This has been, at the beginning, I was worried we weren't going to have enough material to fill the time, but we could go for another hour easily and get into even more details. But this has been terrific and really appreciate it. Yorai, you should also consider as one of your partners our little organization in the United States, Friends of Israel's Environment, and we are doing everything we can on over here to help support Adam Teva Vadin and of course broader environmental issues and all environmental issues in Israel. Tammy, thank you so much. Your leadership has always been so inspirational, and we really value our partnership. And Ethan, it's always great to hear from you, and it was a great story from Washington State. So we'll take that with us as we go about our day. And to all of you who joined us today, thank you so much. And if you'd like to learn more, please just go to our website at adamteva.org.il, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
You too.